Join us every Wednesday for InFocus, a weekly talk show produced by the St. Kitts Nevis Information Service, where we provide exclusives with key persons within the government and discuss pertinent, relevant, and interesting matters that affect us all. Tune in every Wednesday, live on ZIZ Radio and streamed live on Facebook at SKNIS Media and ZIZ Online. InFocus, your government, your business.
I'm Ian Richards. Welcome to InFocus, a weekly program where we zoom in on what's happening within and throughout the government, your government. Women empowerment. It's a term that we've heard repeated again and again by Prime Minister the Honorable Dr. Terence Drew. At home, at forums, both at home and also internationally, including at the United Nations General Assembly. Under his leadership, we've seen historic strides being made as the federal cabinet and the federal parliament has the highest number of women ever. This trend of women in leadership position runs throughout the public sector. What is the strategy behind this thrust by the government, and what are the benefits for the people of St. Kitts and Nevis, especially for men? Joining us today to discuss these issues is the Minister of State responsible for Gender Affairs, the Honorable Isalean Phillip. We'll also be joined with the Minister, the Permanent Secretary responsible for the aforementioned ministry, Azilla Clarke. We'll also take your questions, leave them in the comments section of the stream and during this program, and as we delve into your government, your business. Minister Phillip, welcome. Certainly it's a pleasure to have you on the debut edition of our program.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm honored to be the first.
It's wonderful to have you. So as mentioned, Minister, you hold responsibility for gender affairs. Now we've heard two terms that are used frequently, gender equality and gender equity. Can you expound on the difference between the two?
Well, that's a really good question, because I think oftentimes we kind of confuse the two. So when we think about the difference between gender equity and gender equality, I'll start with gender equality. So we think about equality as being able, both males and females, men and women, being able to access the same rights and privileges that have typically been ascribed legislatively, systematically, institutionally. Now, historically, when it comes to the women's movement, the feminist movement, it was really advocating for equality, because we know there was a time when women were not allowed to vote, where women were not allowed to go to school, where women were not allowed to access just what was standard ascribed rights and privileges in society just by virtue of the fact that they were female. Right. And so instances like that, that's where we talk about inequality. So, and that's why I think oftentimes now, when we think about gender equality, we're really thinking about applying a human rights perspective, because we want to make sure that regardless of your gender, regardless of your sex, your race, that you are able to benefit from the rights and privileges that are ascribed by the law and by society. And so we know that in certain jurisdictions, certain places, there is still a struggle for us to achieve gender equality. So for example, in Saudi Arabia, 2018 was the time when they actually eliminated the law that prohibited women from driving. Right. So that is an instance of gender inequality that we see in our local context. So I only just found this out when I got into office. So the Department of Gender Affairs, we run a Women in Prison program. But there's an inequality in terms of the policies for the prison, where women are not allowed to go outside of the prison. So oftentimes we see men who are inmates in the prison, they go outside, they're able to do work and able to do different things, but women are just not allowed to leave the prison. That is a policy that's an instance of gender inequality, because for what reason are women not allowed to leave the prison, right? So that is equality. That is what we talk about when we talk about gender equality, making sure that we all have access to the same rights and privileges. There's no reason for us to not have access equally when it comes to those things.
As it relates to what you just mentioned in terms of women inmates not being able to leave the prison. Is something you'd like to see change?
It is, absolutely, because one of the things for our prison program is that, we try to engage the women just like we would for male inmates in terms of skills development, educational development. Women are supported in terms of doing little crafts and those kinds of things. It could be an opportunity for women to leave the prison to display what they can do, and also to have opportunities to contribute to community development as we have the male inmates doing. Why can we not have women go out and do some of the gardening beautification of our roundabouts? We see our men going out and doing painting in certain offices. Why can women not also get opportunities to develop those skills? There is no reason in this day and age as to why that policy still exists. And so yes.
You're saying women can do it too?
Of course. I mean, that is an area of inequality in our local context.
Right. So, Minister, let's speak a bit now about the government's overall policy as it relates to women empowerment. What can you tell us about that?
Well, there's no general overall policy. We know we have the Honorable Dr. Terence Drew, who is a big advocate for women's empowerment and for actually seeing women in positions taking on leadership and thinking about how we can mainstream women's empowerment. And so in terms of the approach, at least that is guided by the Ministry and the Department of Gender Affairs, we're really trying to fulfill the vision in terms of seeing how we can empower women financially and economically, to seeing how we can improve equity. So, I wasn't able to kind of highlight when it comes to equity, we want to think about how we can actually achieve equality when it was denied historically for years. So equity is about fairness. And so we want to think about how can we be fairer in the way that we ensure women and men actually benefit from whatever it is occurring in society. So, for example, because of the historic inequalities that would have existed, we have inequalities where we see there are fewer women in representation and leadership. So the initiative that the Prime Minister, the Honorable Dr. Terence Drew, has taken to appoint women in leadership positions, that is an effort to be more equitable in terms of the distribution of power and resources. And also when we think about programs that are run for women to support, to reduce the gap when it comes to poverty, because we do know from data that we have that poverty has a female face, because the majority of single-headed households are headed by women.
Right. And
women, single women who have multiple children, dependents, and who typically have jobs that pay less. And so poverty has a female face. And so we want to be more equitable by hosting programs that are tailored for women, that seek to empower them by providing them resources through education, training, and finances so that they can establish themselves, to be business owners, to be entrepreneurs. And so that is some of the policy initiatives that we're taking to be more equitable so that we can actually achieve equality.
Right. Equity leads to equality.
Right. Equity is the action and the approach to achieve substantive equality in the ways that we want to see it. Yes.
Right. So you just mentioned some policy initiatives, Minister. I have to ask, because you were appointed Minister of State back in August 29th. And of course, coming in, persons, we'll have expectations. There are certain things that we would want to see. How does that align with what it is you were actually charged to do happening right now?
Well, I think for me personally, as somebody who has always had an interest in gender and development, and also based on how that connects with the vision for Dr. Terence Drew and the Labour administration, is that I aspire to see us be able to address some of these issues when it comes to the disadvantages that women face. So we also know, which is an unequal statistic, is that when it comes to things like social problems, like domestic violence, women are majoritively the ones who are victims and who are affected. And that is a problem that we see, that we saw was perpetuated even to a greater extent because of COVID-19. And that is a social problem that we've had for years, and it trickles down into our younger generations of women, with our girls. And so my vision, my expectation is to see how we can address some of these issues by engaging not only women but also men. I think oftentimes when it comes to talking about gender, people always assume it's always just about women, but it really isn't. We need everybody to be involved. And you know, the way that I think about engaging men is, of course, I think we do need opportunities for men to shift their understandings, or to shift our ideas of what healthy masculinity or positive masculinity looks like. I think historically, socioculturally, we have pushed this sense that masculinity only looks a certain type of way. And I think that contributes to the level of, contributes somewhat to the violence, to the level of misguided sense of control and dominance of what you need to do in order to be a man and to establish yourself in that way. And so we need a whole culture shift around that. And so, addressing things like gender-based violence. So we sought to take steps in that regard to protect victims and survivors with the changes that we made in the domestic violence legislation.
Right.
And then, of course, through the ministry and the Department of Gender Affairs, we're really looking to do some public education and advocacy so people can understand that, violence is never okay in relationships. We also push to have our boys' mentorship program, because we obviously, if we want to talk about healthy masculinities, we talk about teaching that at an early age, to be able to pair young boys with men who are doing well, who are role model type of men who want to volunteer to support the younger generation, just knowing what they would have gone through and the efforts that they would have made to do better and to become better men.
Right, and Minister, as you mentioned that, I recall back in October last year, you would have attended to a committee, it's the 83rd session for the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. It's commonly referred to as CEDA. Now, that was held in Geneva. And you were able to update the international community, the delegates there, on the steps that are being taken in St. Kitts and Nevis to help to protect women from gender-based violence and discrimination. What are some of the key takeaways from that conference?
So yes, that was actually quite significant for us, and it was very important for us to be represented at that conference, because St. Kitts and Nevis was actually one of the first countries in the region to sign on to the CEDAW Convention. We signed on in 1985. And since we signed on, we have only ever reported one time, and that would have been in 2002. And so 20 years later, we have always, when we sign on to these conventions, we have an obligation to actually improve and implement the things, and to also report on how we're doing. And so we were well received at the conference. There were a lot of questions. I spent almost 3 hours sitting in questions, and I think the committee was quite impressed with the strides that we have made, particularly when it comes to having implemented domestic violence legislation. Originally, that was in, I think, 2014. They were impressed with that, and just the strides we have been making in terms of supporting and reducing instances of teenage pregnancy. So we have a Project Viola that they would have commented on and given us quite a bit of credit for. They also recognize, just in the new administration, just with the increases in numbers of women in leadership, that is something that they were particularly pleased about and commended. But the areas that we have to improve on, they noted those things. And so just in terms of implementing our policy, accessibility to legislation in terms of things being online, data collection to identify trends in poverty that maybe a little bit outdated. And so we do have work to do in terms of that. And of course, when it comes to there's more that we can do in terms of empowering women through entrepreneurship, particularly in the rural areas, in traditional areas that are traditionally dominated by men. So those are some of the things that they would have mentioned. They encouraged us to implement temporary special measures, which really essentially means we should prioritize women as a category when it comes to programming.
Right, and it's interesting, as you mentioned, about placing legislation online. Of course, there some legislation where the legislation can be found at the Law Commission website.
Yes.
And also the official Gazette's bill that was recently
That's
passed
right.
in Parliament. So
Right, that's right. And so this is some of the things for our next report. We can say, see, we're doing these things. So this is really good for us.
Right. Now, Minister, you also mentioned about men and the facts of masculinity, trying to change the aspect of it. And it led me back to a comment that the Prime Minister made where he spoke about empowering women, where he said that not only will women benefit, but men will also benefit, and children. Talk to us a bit about that.
Well, we have to think about, you know, when it comes to empowering women, particularly if you think about women's economic empowerment. When you empower a woman, you have the potential to change lives. And, you know, there's an old adage and a quote they talk about, you know, you feed a woman, you feed a, you know, entire nation, or you educate a woman, you educate an entire nation. And that is essentially because we recognize, especially in our context, that, you know, we have a majority of matriarchal households. And so, of course, if you empower a woman financially, you know, you are also feeding her children. She will make sure that her children are well cared for. When you bring women into spaces that were perhaps predominantly represented by men, you bring in a different perspective. And I think, you know, what women add to a space is new ideas, new ways of doing things, and we need that. And so it will help the bottom line for a business that has a board of men, if they have 1-2 women on that board, to be able to increase the profitability for everyone. So in that instance, everybody can benefit. And so it's a matter of incorporating the full scale of competence and abilities that we have available to us in our human population, so that we can all benefit in ways that we may not have imagined, because maybe before we didn't necessarily include women in certain spaces, or women that didn't have as big a voice, or maybe women just were not necessarily able to access those spaces. And so when we include women, everybody benefits. Our children get fed, our children have healthier life outcomes, and our men benefit because of what is already established. Women can come in to help improve and add to make that better, so that everybody benefits.
Right. Okay, Minister, stand by. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be welcoming the Permanent Secretary responsible for Gender Affairs, Azilla Clarke. In Focus, we'll be right back.
The general public is advised that the use of the New Road Family Park for special events such as parties, luncheons, or receptions, etc. must be done via booking at the Department of Social Services and Community Development. This is necessary to avoid schedule conflicts and streamline activities. Bookings can be made at the offices of the Department of Social Services and Community Development at Victoria Road or Lime Keel upstairs the Antioch Baptist Church. For more information, you can contact 662-5539.
If you haven't done it as yet, please do it today. Subscribe to our YouTube page at SKNIS Media for regular updates, live coverage, and even more information on your government. While you're at it, like, share, and interact with our Facebook and Instagram pages at SKNIS Media and SKNIS Info.
And we're back with In Focus. Joining us now, as promised, is the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry responsible for Gender Affairs, Azilla Clarke. Azilla, welcome.
Thank you.
Certainly
Happy to be here.
Yes, a pleasure to have you. So we started, Ms. Clarke, talking a bit about women empowerment, and I would like you to join the conversation now by speaking specifically to the National Gender Equality Policy and Action Plan 2022-2027. Now, that was launched, I believe, in June 2022. Can you tell us about the design framework and how it's being used by the government to facilitate women empowerment?
Certainly. First of all, I must continue to extend the country's appreciation to UNESCO, the funding agency that provided the technical and financial support for the policy to be drafted and therefore cabinet approved. The policy outlines about 8 priority areas that have been identified as framework for which women's empowerment will occur. And from those priority areas, actions and activities have been identified in the action plan. Our intention as a ministry now is to be able to reorganize our Department of Gender Affairs to be able to fit to the priority areas. We've always worked on more gender-related or sex-related activities, so the male platform, the women platform, boys and girls platform, but now it needs to be extended to the priority areas, which extend from, based on the Sustainable Development Goals, environment, financial empowerment, education, and the like. So that will require some internal restructuring and then reaching out to our partners to be able to come on board. Previously, the department had gender focal points in most ministries to be able to assist not only with data capture, but also programming, because the intention is to streamline gender throughout everything that we do. It is not unique to the Ministry of Social Development and Gender Affairs, but it should be a part of every ministry's programming. Not only programming, but reporting. For every activity that you do, how did it impact? Well, what numbers were serviced, male to female, and then what were the impacts and results, male by female. So that also requires some reorientation and training in that regard. And then, of course, to ensure that the general public sees the results. Where have we taken rural women in relation to agriculture, employment? What are we doing for our girls and young women as they go through the stages? So you take them in age and chronological development stages, as well as depending on their needs in related to those. So that framework provides us an impressive guide to do so. It is exciting on one hand and threatening on the other, because it does show everything that we should be doing. But it does give us a timeline in which to do so. And fully supported by our government, civil society, and international partners, we are confident that we can put it as a grounded working document for us to see the results throughout our lifespan.
So it's a measuring stick.
Oh, yes.
You satisfied with where we're at?
Well, we just got it. So, I mean, our baselines are not as impressive as they should be, but with all things, baseline provide you the groundwork for where you need to go. It is possible because it does actually reflect the issues on the ground. It is a true petition document. So it does hold us accountable to our international obligations, Sustainable Development Goals, CEDA, and other conventions that we've signed, which we're mandated to do, but it also puts a very clear local lens on the document, which is always appreciated, because sometimes it is easy for consultants to cut and paste and give you a document that may not reflect your local culture, but ours definitely is. So while it is not where we want, we didn't get a good enough baseline grade, it allows us to be able to have ambitions to move forward, and we are confident that we can do so.
Right. Minister, we spoke about the priorities of the government earlier. What's your thoughts on the document?
So I've read it. I think it is quite comprehensive, particularly how it lays out the 8 different focal areas, because as the PS would have mentioned, it does help to connect the lens of gender across all sectors and all areas that the government would administer in. So, and we've seen the realization of that since, the new administration took office, where we hear a lot in terms of the recent COP that was in Egypt. We had the Minister of Environment, and they had a segment, a day, where they focused on gender and how the climate change and climate action actually impacts women, particularly in countries that are more on the Pacific side, that are more prone and vulnerable and susceptible to the impacts of climate change. And so we see that. We see it in, obviously, areas of governance. And so we're seeing it more and more. We're seeing it in terms of business and entrepreneurship with programs that are being implemented. And so we're seeing the streamlining happening, and it's occurring now. And so we do want that to be spread across. And so I do think, the document does provide a very good foundational framework as a guide, which is essentially what it should do as a policy framework, for us to have a sense of where we need to get to and how we ought to get there.
Right. And Ms. Clarke, you mentioned the public sector, but is there a role for the private sector and NGOs to play in the national policy? Oh,
of course. Actually, the private sector and civil society probably are, in some areas, shelter provision, some areas of social protection are actually key there. So it does provide, in every one of the priority areas, it calls for public-private partnership, the involvement of civil society, key actions and lessons that we can learn from or put in practice from what has been done locally by our civil society entities. So yes, it is, not to sound cliche, I'm sure persons would have fed up from COVID time, but it does require all hands on deck approach. And I think that should be something that is repeated throughout. So there is opportunity for civil society and public sector to continue and enhance their role as it relates to gender mainstreaming and gender equality.
And earlier you also thanked UNESCO. Can you speak a bit more about the role that UNESCO would have played in shaping the policy? Because it's important for persons to recognize the value that international partnerships have in helping St. Kitts and Nevis to achieve its objectives.
Oh, certainly. They provided the financial and technical support for the retention of the consultant, Ms. Dwinette Eversley, and as well as the support for the civil society, public sector, private sector engagement. So the sessions by which she went out and hosted discussions with our men's council, boys group, etc. Because as we all know, nothing for us without us. That's something I learned from the disabled population. So we can't be talking about relations between men and women and don't bring them to the table. But finding the spaces for them to come together within the structures of a state entity, sometimes it's confining. But with a consultant, we meet them where they're at. And the consultant was able to listen to them from the blocks to the classrooms to the meeting spaces to be able to place the inputs into the document that we now have.
And in reference to UNESCO, of course, it's an organ of the United Nations. Now, of course, the United Nations has SDGs. Goal number 5 speaks to achieving gender equality and empowering all girls by 2030. Is that realistic for St. Kitts and Nevis, given the global community is lagging behind in meeting the SDG benchmarks, especially since, of course, considering that the Millennium Development Goals was there and they had to be more or less scrapped for the SDGs. Is it realistic?
What I can say is what the region has learned better from the Millennium Development to the Sustainable Development is that we now have both CARICOM-specific indicators and OECD-specific indicators. The charge is on countries to now do their country-specific indicators. So while the Sustainable Development Goals is the global level, it allows us to set our own benchmarks because some of the, when we talk about poverty eradication measures, now when you dive down into your own country-specific, you will see that you're doing well. We do well on education. So within that, it allows us to set different benchmarks to be able to meet the international obligations. So it's all international and global markers are always adventurous and goal setting in their minds, but I think it challenges the individual member governments to be able to keep an eye on where the world needs to go, because we are a global partner, but also being reflective of making a plan that is more palpable to its own current situation. So for us, the tenets of women's empowerment, with thanks to the Taiwanese Technical Mission and its embassy, as well as education, filling the gaps. We have great graduation rates amongst our girls in the technical fields, but it's not reflected at employment. So we need to begin to explore those, especially in line with the theme for this year's observation. So we have to put the research lens on it to be able to make constructive policy, strategy decisions locally as to how we fill those gaps, how to retain talent. Also, how do we count talent? They may not be here in St. Kitts, but they might be making regional and global inputs, and we need to be able to, through the diaspora unit, make those better connections so we count where our citizens and nationals are making that impact. Might not be in the 68 square miles or 100 and whatever that math is, but it definitely is within the global society. So always advantageous, but we always look at those as interesting challenges to attain.
And Minister, is there anything that you care to share on that?
I mean, I echo the sentiments of P.S. Azilla here, because I think we do need to be realistic in terms of where we are at. Of course, the SDGs are aspirational, and we've, as you mentioned, heard that globally we're potentially lagging behind attaining the 2030 deadline. But of course, we had COVID-19. But I think, as much as COVID-19 exposed a lot of weaknesses, it has created opportunities for us. And so I think it has shown us where we can seek to improve, where we need to channel more resources. And so we, in that regard, of course, data collection is something that we certainly want to improve upon, and we have to improve upon so that we can actually make more evidence-based policy decisions and programming. But I think it's certainly possible for us as a Twin Island Federation to be able to improve some of the things in terms of, our rates of poverty, our rates of violence against women, some of the things that we know glaringly impact us and impact women disproportionately. I do think we can certainly improve by 2030.
Right. And of course, the government has quite a number of social programs that are aimed to help achieve those goals. Not that it was designed for that, but of course it would help. Now, one of the more popular programs, of course, would be the Poverty Alleviation Program. It was recently restructured, and I gather, based on the information that was sent out, that women are a priority in terms of one of the beneficiaries. They are being placed as a priority. Can you speak a bit about the type of things that are built in to help women to achieve and continue to benefit from the Poverty Alleviation Program, as you recall, given that it was recently restructured?
Certainly. The Poverty Alleviation Program, its eligibility criteria has been extended a bit. Most persons focus on households earning less than $3,000, but the added statement is and unable to meet their basic needs, because the economic threshold is a tentative one. Just making under does not expressly mean vulnerability. And then secondly, with the priority areas identified from cabinet, seniors, persons with disabilities, and families with children. Again, within, well, probably not the disability so much because that is behavior-based or genetics, but within the aging and with children, a majority of our children reside with our women. As the minister was saying, you feed a woman, you impact an entire household or generation. Also, our seniors, women are living longer. We are much more health conscious, even though it doesn't appear so all the time. We're much more health conscious than our men. And I guess because we always have the burden of the household, we add those things into our annual schedules. Men are always, we know the time markers for the examinations we have to do. You have to do this at this age, that at that age, and men don't have the same recall. So we are seeing this, disproportionately women excelling in those areas. So yes, one of the intended or unintended benefits of the Poverty Alleviation Program is that it directly aligns with the mandate to be able to not only address poverty, but pay attention to the female or gendered perspective of poverty. So within that, yes, it has within its case management now is based on needs-based. What are the challenges of these individual households and their dynamics? And how do you add the additional services of the state, private sector and civil society to compensate or add more quality to those? How do you educate and add information and knowledge so better decisions are made? As well as better planning for life. So that is an additional component that, though promised since its inception, was not able to be operationalized, that will be operationalized through this reform. And within those, it gives us a bird's eye view into that population. As it was administered by a different department or ministry, we are super excited now to see how that population lives its challenges to be able to advise for future policy, program, and activity-based help and assistance for those populations. And
Minister, the Poverty Alleviation Program really does complement nicely the objectives of the Ministry of Gender Affairs and Social Development.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it does. It does quite so. And it's unfortunate that in the initial iteration that the program was so politicized in the earlier days, and so but really and truly, as a poverty alleviation program, we're really seeking to address and reduce instances of poverty across the federation. And as I would have mentioned before, now that the program sits within the Ministry of Social Development, we do seek to ensure that we meet the needs of those who are most vulnerable. And so that is how, as Pierce would have mentioned, women are disproportionately represented when it comes to those who are most vulnerable, just by nature of our context. And women being, heads of single parent households, and also the elderly, where we have it's more females who tend to live longer. And so, with the program in its new iteration and the way that we are seeking to upgrade the program, it's really important, for us to have the public's buy-in and the public's understanding that, the nature of the program in terms of the impact it wants to make to help to support the most vulnerable does mean that certain conditions now have to be placed on it where they were none before. And these conditions and the processes that are being implemented are necessary for us to collect data. So we had the application process, which never existed before with the iteration of the program under the former administration. And so now we have an application process which allows us to assess our households a lot better. We now have conditions in terms of priority groups. So obviously that is the elderly, persons with disabilities, unemployed with children, employed with children, and then coming down the line. Because it's really intended, the program as a poverty reduction initiative is really intended to support those who are most in need. And that is what we are really trying to achieve. So it's really unfortunate when it's politicized by political propagandists. Unfortunately, I see certain things on social media about, the PAP. But what we're really trying to do is see how we can cater to those who are most in need. And that disproportionately is women of different age groups, of different backgrounds. And so we certainly seek the public's patience and their understanding, particularly as it comes to our administration of the program. The change, it is ongoing, and it will take some time because we have had to apply some conditionalities so that people do understand that it's also, with the case management, we're really seeking to empower. And the case management, the empowerment aspect is also an addition that where we are seeking to support individuals who are on the program so that they're not indefinitely just receiving a handout from the government. Because we do want you to be, autonomous, we do want you to be self-sustaining, and that is why the case management approach will implement things like, assessments, it will implement things like seeing how we can support families to do better financial management of the resources that they do have, so that perhaps they're not living outside their means, to see how we can direct them to opportunities for more employment. And of course, we look forward to seeing how the program grows and evolves over time, and we continue to collect the data and the information so that we can improve the program so that it actually achieves the objective of reducing poverty and catering to those who are most in need.
Right, and certainly the poverty alleviation program is a topic that we can go on and on
I
about.
know, we should have a show just for that.
Absolutely, we certainly can look into that sometime. We're going to take a quick break. We're up against the clock, and we'll be right back with more In Focus.
If you haven't done it as yet, please do it today. Subscribe to our YouTube page at SKNIS Media for regular updates, live coverage, and even more information on your government. While you're at it, like, share, and interact with our Facebook and Instagram pages at SKNIS Media and SKNIS Info.
We continue our discussion with the Minister, Honorable Isalean Phillip, who is responsible for gender affairs, and her Permanent Secretary, Azilla Clarke. We spoke about empowerment earlier. It's an E word. I want to speak a bit about another E word that leads to empowerment, entrepreneurship. Of course, there's a program that the department has built in. What can you tell us about that? It's also being done in collaboration with the Taiwanese.
Yes, the Women's Empowerment, Entrepreneurship and Financial Inclusion Project provides an opportunity for there to be business entrepreneurial training to women in various sectors. We have completed 4 unsent kits, 2 on Nevis. And for 2023, we just completed a second round in relation to beauty and cosmetology. Because what we have found, not only by the oversubscription of interest, but also the duality of that sector whereby you can be otherwise employed and based on the key activity times in the year, actually significantly supplement your income. So music festival, Culturama, Christmas, etc. You do a couple of those and you actually have income ready to make to invest in your household. So those are there. We've actually came from a meeting earlier with them about a skills training one for certification. So the beauty of the program, it was both training as well as grant investment for persons to go out and either start or enhance their businesses. Because again, because of our high income earning status as a federation, many of our income or international aid is loans or others. So the Embassy of the Republic of China, Taiwan, provides us the opportunity to get grant investment that can be placed right in the hands of our women to enhance or establish their businesses. And across the federation, we have every group, we had about 10, so that's about 40 new businesses that we are studying in conjunction with the Small Business Development Center to continue to facilitate their growth. Because I think the new mantra is whatever is your talent or skill, how do you monetize that? And making those connections is where the entrepreneurial training came into being. So they did financial management, marketing, business planning, communications, all of that, so that they'll be able to carve out a niche and a presence in our small, medium enterprise sector that would be able to maximize not only their capacity, but also their skill.
Any success stories that you care to share? On the top, off the top of your head, just one.
Yes, and I don't want to name drop because I always get them wrong. But there is Paulette's Kitchen in St. Peter's, I think, and in Nova. Last names despise me. So these two are women from our food and beverage, and both graduated the first and then came back to be featured speakers at our beauty entrepreneurship. And I think her name is Minerva Sadler, but don't quote me. Oh, Gaskin. Miss Gaskin was able to come back, and from the close of the training to the start of the other, she had seen an uptick in her business. She gave revenue updates, client referrals, and now she is fully sustainable in her food and beverage business. We've made some commitments as a ministry to utilize some once they have done their business licenses and etc. Because again, as the state, we have a responsibility to play a hand in that business. So yes, they are amazing, amazing stories throughout and within. We have some from the beauty. There were things that they were doing on the side. And then when you see their creations and their business names and their logos and their Facebook presence, these women are taking it as seriously as the investment required.
Right, and Minister, as we prepare to wrap up, of course, you would have visited Taiwan recently. I imagine that some of these projects, you were able to learn, to share a bit about some of the success stories. Of course, we do some reporting back to them, of course, as the fact that they do grant funding for us. But also, I'm sure that you were able to learn a few things over there. What can you tell us about your trip?
So that was actually a very valuable travel experience. So we were able to go to Taiwan, and the reason they held the forum was so that they could have reports and see what impact their investments have made, because this is a project and technical assistance and support that is provided to multiple countries that are partners, diplomatic partners with Taiwan. And so St. Kitts and Nevis, we were able to go. I was accompanied by one of the success stories from the program, Miss Isalean Clarke, who's from Nevis, runs a business who produces like hot sauces, all from locally produced ingredients. And so it was very good. It was a great opportunity for us to go and demonstrate and to report on the impact of this investment and this partnership with Taiwan, so that we could potentially see more investment in future, so that we can have future iterations of the project. And so while I was there, of course, we would have been conversing with the foreign minister, with the representatives from the Taiwan ICDF, who actually implements the project and coordinates it, and just kind of advocating to say this is actually very valuable for us here in St. Kitts and Nevis, and we would really like to see further iterations and future iterations with considerations for training in perhaps more non-traditional areas, so that women can benefit. We know that there's promise of a construction sector that, with the new housing plans for this administration. So how about we get more women trained in construction so that they can benefit from that sector? So these are some of the things that I would have gone to be able to connect and discuss with the people with the money, so that potentially, hopefully, we can see further investments. But even outside of that, just having St. Kitts and Nevis represented on these international spaces is actually very big. Because we are the smallest sovereign state in the Western Hemisphere, but we lift well above our weight. And I think it's very important for us to be represented in these areas and to demonstrate just how all of us as a people, our natural resource, the resource that we have is our people and our high literacy rates and our trainability, and to be able to market that as ripe for investment and success.
Minister responsible for gender affairs, the Honorable Isalean Phillip, Permanent Secretary Azilla Clarke, thank you so much for joining us for the debut edition of InFocus. And we thank our viewers as well for joining us. We apologize we were not able to get to the questions. The topic, I'm sure the discussion you would have found was very enlightening, and so time just ran away from us. We apologize. But we encourage you to join us next week at the same time, at the same place for another edition of InFocus. I'm Ian Richards.
Join us every
You want
Wednesday
us to spend some time
for
answering them online?
InFocus, a weekly talk show
What
produced
kind of
by the
questions,
St. Kitts
Debbie?
Nevis Information Service, where we provide exclusives with key persons within the government and discuss pertinent, relevant, and interesting matters that affect us all. Tune in every Wednesday, live on ZIZ Radio and streamed live on Facebook at SKNIS Media and ZIZ Online. InFocus, your government, your business. Join us every Wednesday